The information economy has arrived. The world is teeming with innovation as new business models reinvent every industry. Inside Analysis is your source of information and insight about how to make the most of this exciting new era. Learn more at InsideAnalysis.com.
InsideAnalysis.com.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
Oh, yes, indeed, folks. Welcome to The Future is Right. The future is careening towards us faster than ever, it seems, these days, folks. And today's topic is going to talk about how you can really leverage the power available today through the cloud. We're going to talk about APIs, application program interfaces. APIs are the gateways to innovation. They're the gateways to data. We're going to find out they're gateways to functionality, too. It's not just data that's flying across those little transoms. It's also instructions of how to do things. So on both sides, whether it's on the API side or the side access of the API, well, what you want to do is really understand how these APIs work, and they're all a little bit different. I've been told that DigitalOcean is the best API. That's what my developer friends tell me. But APIs, they are super important. They're like faucets or spigots, right? So if you think about a faucet, you turn on the faucet to get water, you turn off the faucet to stop the flow of the water. APIs are kind of like that for data and for instruction, basically. You turn them on, you get something from it, you turn it off. Well, you can imagine that they're very important. It's a very important part of your architecture these days as we move into this hybrid cloud world, which I think is going to be the reality for quite some time. They become very important. So architecturally, you want to think about stuff. Before the show here, we were chit-chatting about design and how I'm so proud of my daughter for being a big Pirates fan. We're here in Pittsburgh. She loves going to the games, and it's a beautiful venue because the urban planners really thought about stuff. All the seats in some way or other face the outfield, which is the skyline. So you see this beautiful skyline for night games and even day games, of course, but at night, the lights come on. It's just really, really good stuff. So they thought about that. The ingress, the egress, it's all important. And we have several great guests for you today. We're going to be hearing from Lori MacVittie of F5, David Linthicum of Deloitte, and our good buddy Matt McLarty from Boomi. And with that, let's bring in our first guest, Lori MacVittie. You've been doing this stuff for a while now, 17 plus years at F5. And you've really made a name for yourself and helped evangelize the importance of architectural choices and design choices. So tell us a bit about yourself and what you do. What you're doing in the space of APIs today.
Wow. Well, thanks for having me. Like you said, I've been with F5 for 17 years. I've been doing a lot of evangelism through all of it. I'm at this point, I'm a distinguished engineer. So now I just give my opinion about things, which is kind of fun. I try to be right. And APIs is huge because it touches everything from automation, right? We do app delivery and security. So how do you automate that? How do you let people automate that? How do you integrate with people who want to automate it, right? APIs are the answer. So there's APIs in use as, right, business, right? How do we make all of this possible? And then how do you secure and deliver APIs? Because, right, APIs are something that people use to do those same things in the wild. So, I spend a lot of time looking at the market, looking at the technologies and how they're being impacted by APIs and vice versa. And, again, I give my opinion. So
yeah, well, let's get your opinion on a couple interesting topics here. So we were talking before the show about the history, about SOAP versus REST, for example, and the WSDL folks, the W3C folks years ago are saying you should use SOAP, the silly people said, we're going to go ahead and use REST. And then new things come along, Kafka, Apache Kafka, and streaming technologies. And that, to me, not to get too far off topic, but when I think about streaming architectures and Kafka, and of course, there's Red Panda is another one, and there's a few others out there. Red Panda, I think, rewrote Kafka in C++, I think is what they did, because they said they wanted to be more efficient. So they went out and they did that. There's Pulsar, there's Flink, there are other services. But to me, again, this could come through an API, right? As this data is channeling into your organization, these streaming architectures, I think, are fantastic, but they're really seemingly only good for net new use cases because there is this sort of mismatch in terms of how they operate versus how the rest of your stack operates. But I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that and the evolution of design for APIs and design and management.
Wow. So yes, streaming data, very different than, right, how we normally think about accessing a record, right? It's right, real time versus transactional, right? And those are very different data types. They're very different traffic patterns. So the way that you, right, have to access them is going to be very different. And you design differently for that. But the rise of streaming data and kind of the rise of the awareness of data that, hey, that's what we want. That's why applications exist, is just to get at data for us, has kind of made it, can we get the data closer to the user? And APIs are doing that, right? You mentioned new things. GraphQL is rising in part to do that, right? It's a more direct way to access data as well as federate other APIs, which is great. But really, it's about getting closer to the data and making sure that that happens faster. So when you're designing, you have to think about things like, what kind of data am I going to be delivering? Is it going to be, real time? Does it need to be constantly updated? Is it just a record in time? How fast do people need it? Is it going to an application or directly to a client? Is it going to someone else? Is it a third party, right? What is the use for that data? That kind of drives a lot of the design of the API.
Yeah. And so when I think about how big a deal this is for the hybrid cloud world, I mean, you're always trying to optimize performance, right? If you get right down to brass tacks, there are lots of ways you can do things. And what you want to do is be able to optimize performance and really give yourself a fighting chance to live in a fast evolving world. I think that's probably the real kicker these days. What did I hear? We had John Santaferraro on a couple of weeks ago, and he goes, agile is going to kill, or agility is going to kill agile. I was like, what? I didn't think about it. His point was, yeah, this agile stuff, that's great, but you need to be really agile, like in your business, and your architecture needs to be designed to support that kind of thing. APIs play a big role here. In your opinion, how big a role do they play? And what can a company do to enable themselves to get this agility?
Wow, breathe first, right? Right. I think we have to go back and remember that, as far as, like an enterprise goes, right? The enterprise architecture is the technical representation of the business.
Right.
And as we've gotten more and more digital, those two things have come closer together. So APIs and are really, I like to call them layer 8 on the stack, right? They're the business layer. They are really describing your business and how you're going to interface with it. So that's a huge thing, that you have to actually talk to the business people, and the business people have to understand, right? The technology is not just an afterthought. They have to be designed together. So they need to come together and design that in a very deliberate and thoughtful way, right? While also thinking about, how might someone abuse that? Because the other thing we do is expose this to everyone, to partners, to the public, to random people, right, that we met. Hey, use our API. That's nice. How might they abuse that? Because they will.
Right. No, that's right. So that gets into the whole security issue. Let's talk about that, and then I'll bring in our next guest. But as soon as I started researching for this program, in my mind was that exact question. It's like, okay, if this is your new entry point for requests to serve your prospects, your customers, your high value customers, or your freebie customers, whatever, well, lots of people are going to be trying to come in that door, and lots of little tricks, like, over the years, SQL injection is a real problem for organizations. Phishing attempts through email, like there are bad guys everywhere these days, and they love to get creative about to sneak into your environment. And I've thought to myself over the years, wouldn't it be possible to sneak in through the API? Talk about security and what you do to secure your APIs.
Well, yes, they do. And I think I've read multiple reports from many different, right, across the market. And yeah, APIs are like the number one way that people are attacking. Right? Because it's a programmatic interface, which implies not just me, right? I actually need something, an app, my mobile phone. I need something to interact with that API. But programmatically, someone can write a script that just click, 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 right, is accessing that API. It's designed for that, in fact.
Right.
So you see things like, right, we're just going to send 1 million bots against you, right? To do
Right.
something,
Right.
Might,
Sure.
yeah, take over an account, take down your business, buy all your sneakers or all of your Xboxes before Christmas,
Right.
right? All of these are things that bots have done. They've leveraged APIs to do that. So they're a great way for us to access it, but that also means that attackers are going to use it too, and they do.
Yeah. And so watching, I mean, sitting there, getting observability into what your APIs are doing is obviously very, very important. I'm sure what you see, because they have to log in and say, oh, here's me, I'm XYZ request. Could you please give me some stuff? Here's me, I'm ABC request. Please give me some stuff. Like that's a critical part of the process is as it comes in, like, do I like you? Are you okay? Or should I shut you off? So I'm guessing you create blacklists, right, for people who come in, and they usually do it by proxy too, so it's hard to keep track of them. But is that one of the tricks that you use, is to kind of set up a list of troublemakers and say, nope, don't let them in. If they come in from that address, no, we know the neighbors, we don't want them.
That's, you can do that, but the list would get so big because most of the attackers they're using machines that they've compromised or bot farms. So, the market's advanced to doing more advanced bot detection, which involves behavior, right? How are they interacting with this API? What are they doing? What are the technical signatures that we can see inside of the data that they're sending, inside the network information they're sending? So observability is huge because you have to see the network characteristics, the TCP stack, and then the actual requests that they're making in order to kind of form a picture of, is this a bot I don't like, or is this a valid user?
Right. No, that makes sense. Well, let's bring in our next guest. We've got David Linthicum of Deloitte waiting patiently in the wings out there. So David, you've been a cloud expert for decades. You've been tracking this stuff for a long, long time. We even joked in the pre-call about how you wrote the book on EAI. I remember that, enterprise application integration, right? When we do a lot of point-to-point stuff, now you got Kubernetes, which is sort of a de facto foundational component that's changing things up. But tell us the latest that you've seen about APIs and API management, and what you think folks should do.
Yeah, APIs are becoming everything in terms of how you manage infrastructure. And so certainly in the clouds, we've always been accessing resources in the clouds via well-defined APIs. At least that's the way we should have done it. Now that we're getting into a multi-cloud deployment, you mentioned hybrid cloud, and we're trying to mix that up with our existing on-premise systems. By the way, throw in edge computing, and by the way, throw in all the net new AI systems that have come online in the last couple of years. We have a complexity issue, and the ability to mediate this complexity typically means that we're getting at these various systems through very similar interfaces that are able to operate across resources. And so APIs become everything because it provides us with the ability to abstract those resources down into common layers that we're able to access as bunches of services, knowledge engines, as behaviors, as application data, things like that. That's able to reduce the amount of complexity and increase the agility of the business, the ability to orchestrate and re-orchestrate business processes to align directly to the business needs versus building everything as a one-off application development project that occurs within a particular cloud provider. That solves a tactical problem. It doesn't solve the strategic, I think, fundamental issues that people are running into today. There's too many moving parts out there. We went from like 3,000 services under management to 10,000 services under management. The ability to combine those into common APIs, the ability to manage and secure them through a single interface layer is really kind of the way to go. It's the only way we're going to make cloud scale.
That's a great quote right there. I should write that down. The only way we're going to make cloud scale is to be more responsible and thoughtful in the design and management of APIs, is what you're saying, right?
Absolutely. And we've kind of lost that as a talent. We know how to leverage APIs. We know how to leverage microservices. We know how to build and deploy services. But as far as how we design these properly, in dealing with, Lori just mentioned it, the ability to have different API patterns that serve different purposes, streaming data, the ability to have information that's produced through APIs, and also the ability for APIs to produce behavior, the ability to have them act upon things and act upon data and be able to reuse those from domain to domain to domain seems to be some kind of a lost art. And we had the rise of service-oriented architecture years ago, and everybody thought they were going to get really good at orchestrating these services into reuse and common sets of systems. That hasn't really happened. And we're not putting reuse into thinking how we're design and deploy these APIs, which has to be on the critical path.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I've thought many times about the history of SOA and how it seems to me that the best practices of SOA have sort of been baked into the cloud these days. And even though we don't talk about service orientation, it became a mindset of how to do things in fine grain and coarse grain, for example. And so even though this Kubernetes generation is not a perfect analogy, it's attacking some of the same needs, the same business needs with some of the same principles, right?
It is. And ultimately it becomes a very standard way and a common ecosystem where you can build and deploy these APIs. And I think that's a very helpful thing. We just sometimes speed and the ease of developing these things at what I call the speed of need can get in the way. We're not doing enough in designing these APIs so they're reusable across domains. We're typically designing them so that they're purpose built for a given application task. And that's not what architects do. I mean, Lori said something very profound. Architecture is a representation of the business. Absolutely it is. And the ability to get to one optimized layer to bring the most value back to the business is really what it needs to achieve. And we're missing that somehow. We seem to throwing lots of technology, lots of very good technology at these problems, and we're just kind of making things worse. We're in a hole and we keep on digging.
Wow. That's pretty interesting. I think we should dig into that. As I think to myself, again, what you're trying to do from an API management perspective is get people what they want, right? So from a data delivery perspective, we've had all sorts of different ways to deliver data, right? We have data warehouses that gave us the refined data. You have data federation, which has been around for many years, is now picking up steam, and just basic stuff like caching. I would imagine on the client side of an API, you could do some intelligent caching to say, aha, I know lots of people are asking for this. I'll just have it at the ready. Boom, here it is. Sometimes you get a deeper request that takes more time. Is that kind of how it works on the back end?
Yeah, it does. The thing is, you need to monitor and design these things to perform well, and they have to be designed around multiple purposes and the way in which you're going to leverage the data. They can't be purpose built for a tactical deployment. They need to have commonality of services so we can start doing data caching. We can start doing behavior caching. We can start doing transactionality with these services. Are able to span different applications and different use cases. And that's kind of where we're missing the mark. We have the tools and technology to do it. We have the API management systems that are well advanced for what they were 5 years ago. I'm just ecstatic in how they work. We just need to use them properly and think through these with the discipline that we need to think through in terms of getting these deployed and in a better state than in which we're deploying them now. In other words, we're just kind of all over the place with how we deploy and manage these APIs.
Right, right. We need some simplicity and some orchestration. Well, folks, we'll be right back. Don't touch that dial. You're listening to Inside Analysis.
Welcome back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, take us to the future. And our next guest has been focused on the future for a long time. He's been looking down the barrel of the future, trying to figure out, all right, how can we plan for this? How can we get around this? How can we leverage these amazing opportunities coming through the cloud? And that is Matt McLarty from Boomi. So Matt, I think you were the one who mentioned on our show about a month ago, the amount of metadata that Boomi has because you've been doing this for a long time. And, instructions are who out there really likes to follow instructions, right? Let me go ahead and get the manual out. Step 1, do this, step 2, do that. Thank goodness for YouTube, right? Just like putting stuff together. If you find the video of someone who can just show you how to do it, that's a real example of my favorite Wittgenstein quote when he said, some things cannot be said, they must be shown. And if you show someone how to do something, oh my God, as opposed to those diagrams, those like 3D diagrams that they try to show you and like, is this the back? Is that the front? Is that the screw that goes in here? Like what? Reading that documentation is just such a pain. Writing documentation is a pain. Of course, now we have large language models that can absorb massive amounts of documentation and give us some information about it. That's pretty cool. But with all that as a background, Matt, I'll throw it over to you. What's the latest in API management and how is Boomi making lives easier?
Yeah.
I think no, great points. In fact, I would say that the when it comes to API management, I don't think there's any way to ignore the age that we're in now. You're talking about the future and looking down the future. It's like the future hit us pretty hard this year with AI all of a sudden exploding onto the scene.
Wow.
So I've been spending a lot of time kind of thinking through, where does AI leave the API space, right? And I think you just mentioned the example there of large language models coming up with succinct summaries of things, which is great if they're accurate. They're not always accurate, right? So we're at a real point now of sort of an impedance mismatch between the level of hype and the level of energy and excitement around AI, and just how ready the technology is for prime time, but also how ready organizations are able to take advantage of the technology. So a lot of the companies I'm working with now are like, yeah, our CEO is telling us you need an AI strategy now. Like we need to do something right now. But the fact of the matter is, being ready to fully leverage the whole AI opportunity is something that takes time. And so you mentioned our experience at Boomi, where we've got this metadata that takes years to build up, and lots of analysis and understanding and curation. And ultimately we have a good base to work from when it comes to making recommendations and doing things in the API management space. But not everybody has that. So I think AI is going to have a huge effect on every technology area. When it comes to APIs, I think that there's a lot of ways that AI is going to impact APIs, and how APIs are going to impact the way people use AI. So like first and foremost, like many things in the technology space, how are people going to access these language models? It's going to be via API. That's what they're doing today. I think we as consumers may go out and play around with ChatGPT and have fun typing. But for the large majority of commercial uses of AI technology, it's going to be integrated into automated processes and behind the scenes into systems of engagement, user experiences. That's all going to be done by API. Right. Prompt engineering is already a term that's out there for like, how do you actually interact effectively with AI models in a way that can give you the results you're looking for? You do prompt engineering. What is the actual medium for prompt engineering? It's APIs for the most part, right? So, there's going to be, I think that there's a huge role when we think about API management of how do you regulate the flow of data between your organization and the AI models you're going to be working with. I think it's going to be impractical for most organizations to be taking, trying to build their own LLMs. Like the amount of data and infrastructure you need to do that is untenable for only, it's really only the hyperscale cloud providers and a few others who are going to be able to do that. So much better to focus on how do you protect your data, interact with these things effectively. And a lot of that comes down to just working with your own data, governing your own data, cleaning your data, and providing the right context. So I think, historically in the API management space, a lot of the focus has been on providers. Like when I've been in the API management business a long time. It's a lot of companies who are saying, hey, we've got stuff, we want to turn it into APIs. We need API management. I think you're going to see a whole new category of API management that's required, where companies are going to say, well, we're going to be consuming all these APIs. We don't want our developers just going off and plugging into every API that's out there in the ecosystem. We need to have governance around that. We need to ensure that we've got data privacy protected. We need to regulate the flow of traffic so that we're protecting quality of service in our systems. So I think that's going to sort of invert the perspective on what type of API management is needed. There's going to be a lot more consumption of APIs in a smaller number of players, and that's going to require a whole new brand of API management.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good prediction. Quite frankly, you think about the importance of leaning on these spigots, these faucets to get your water. I mean, think about how in some older houses, if you're in the shower and someone flushes the toilet or someone turns the washing machine on downstairs, all of a sudden cold water, hot water gets cold, you're like, oh no, stand out of the way is the rule of thumb. Just step out of the way and walk. Old buildings in New York City are terrible about that. And that kind of thing, I mean, you have to be sitting there watching the data that's going out, what is the stress on this system, how can we bolster on the back end to be able to handle all this stuff, and how do you manage, how do you throttle low value requests, and how do you enable high value requests to get through? Are those just business rules or something that get impacted and you sense who's coming in? Oh, sorry, you're in the low tier. I'd imagine that's a piece of metadata on the top of that request that's coming through. It's like, okay, wait a second. And then when the big train goes through that paid a lot of money, then you get your stuff. Is that kind of how it works?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think to David's point earlier about design, right? I think that people, not only are they not necessarily designing their APIs to be developer friendly just from a sort of structuring the messages and the data, but you really need to think about the design of APIs from a quality of service perspective. Like that's a good analogy is these buildings in New York or shared accommodations where you've got all this plumbing and other electrical wiring, all that stuff. That's going to be the enterprises. So not only do we have hybrid cloud where companies are thinking about, okay, I'm going to run these workloads in the cloud, I'm going to run these on-prem, I've got edge computing, like all these things going on. They now are depending on fundamental services from third parties. They're already doing that for cloud infrastructure. I think a lot of organizations don't even realize just how dependent they are on API-based services as it is.
Yeah.
So they might understand that they've got sprawl when it comes to relying on SaaS applications. They've got sprawl when it comes to relying on APIs already. And so I think that and to Lori's point about layer 8, the business layer of your infrastructure, if you think about that, like APIs allow you to have a more normalized view of what that looks like. But from there, there's a lot of paths down into what is actually providing that layer. And so when you think about that perspective of I'm now a consumer of these APIs, which are themselves consumers of other APIs, having that understanding, having that observability and governance around it is crucial. And just one other thing on the AI front that sort of relates back to this is I think there's going to be a lot more opportunity. I am both an optimist and also as a veteran of the industry, I can be a bit cynical about this. Like there's an opportunity there where organizations can rely on APIs, not only as places where they provide data, but as places where they collect data. Like you're going to get you have the opportunity to collect incredible amounts of contextual information about your business. If this is your business layer, not only are you servicing whoever the consumers of these APIs are, you're also at that point of consumption, you understand context. It's not like it's just like somebody walking into a store using a credit card and you see a purchase. Like you've got the full context and the digital footprint of people using these APIs. The more you're able to capture that context at the point of consumption of the APIs, you can feed that back into your systems of intelligence and create this feedback loop where now you have more and more refined contextual information. You can use that to generate more valuable insights, which can be fed back in and so on, and create sort of this flywheel effect. But that's the possibility. A lot of organizations still need to crawl, walk before they run.
Yeah, right. Lori, I'll bring you back in since Matt was kind enough to reference you here. And I'm thinking, and I love this concept, because we're going to do a show on observability later this week. And Lori MacVittie, I'll throw this over to you. To me, observability really should feed design, because when you can see what is being requested of your systems, then you can better understand how to optimize those systems. We put some extra, oomph behind this particular data store or that particular data store because that's what people seem to be wanting. To me, that makes a lot of sense to kind of watch the ingress, the egress, what's coming in, what's going out. There have to be clues in there about how to optimize your design and evolve your design. What do you think, Lori?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it feeds both the business and technical decisions, right? On the business side, if you have that context like Matt was describing, you can also ascribe it to a customer, and you can look at buying patterns and habits and interactions and say, wow, they're not engaging. Maybe it's because the performance they're experiencing is really terrible. Right. So maybe we should do something about that. You can address it from a human element, but on the technical side, it's also, well, why? Right. Oh, because they moved to this remote location. Wow. Well, maybe there's an edge location where we can actually make sure that part of the system is there so everyone there is getting better performance, and actually start making decisions about where you distribute your front end, your data, right? Put your security in a different place, right? What is impacting the performance? Is it just a bad switch somewhere, right? Go in the closet, switch it out, yeah, get a new one. Or is it a distribution problem? Is it a design problem? Right? Is this one API just pulling like too much data? Did you need all of that? Or did you just need a few things, right? I mean, deliberate, thoughtful, right? David touched on this, right? You have to actually think about the design, right? From a security standpoint, it's imperative. Don't give out more than you need to, because that impacts performance, and it's also a security risk. So, you got to approach it more strategically and more deliberately when you design the APIs. Only then, right, are you going to be able to feed that observability in and start understanding the impact and get into that, virtuous cycle of design and data, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And David, I'll bring you back in. I remember learning about code bloat about 20 odd years ago. One of the developers at a company called Damon Consulting, where I was the communications guy, he used that term code bloat. I was like, code bloat, what does that mean? He goes, well, basically what happened is when the processors got really fast, the developers got lazy, because you used to have to be real refined and very assiduous in your choice of code, of functions, and how you layered them, how you strung them together. And then when the processors got fast, who cares? We just do it and wherever we want. And that created bulky, inefficient code. Like my favorite example to pick on is Microsoft from years ago. If you were to go into Microsoft Word and write hello world and then do save as HTML and then open that document in a text editor, it was like 4 pages long. I'm like, okay, I don't think I needed all those meta tags, Microsoft. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. But that was a bit of overkill, to use Lori's term. But what do you think about all that, David?
Yeah, I think it's spot on thinking. I mean, the reality is we're seeing code bloat today around AI-based systems that are built around developments. In other words, using autocoders and things like that are becoming very inefficient ways to do things that are fairly simple. We're making simple things complex.
Right.
So as we move forward, the ability to have the ability to see the span of what these APIs are doing, you just kind of hit the whole observability piece, which I think is spot on. It's about looking at something in more than a single dimension. And so Lori's example with the ability to link performance into customer interaction, link to revenue, and link to industrial behavior, and link that into the future vision of the product, and all these sorts of things that people typically don't think about. Your ability to understand API design and how you build APIs and deploy APIs and secure APIs in the context of all that information really kind of is the secret here. And the reality is we have the information. We have AI ops-based systems. We have observability systems that are built into DevOps. We have certainly lots of best practices in how we build APIs. We're just not thinking about how we do this in a tactics way. So we're getting to the end state where we're getting to something that's going to bring the most value back to the business. It's weird having that kind of discussion, but I think that's what we're doing. When we're building APIs, and I tell this to my teams, figure out which one's going to bring the most value back to the business, not necessarily which one's going to serve the application or even serve the user well. In other words, we're productizing things. We're thinking in a different way versus just doing a one-off build. We're thinking about getting a quality of service that's going to be provided by this API that's typically not going to be there in APIs. And we have to kind of take our game to the next level based on the fact that stakes that are on the line right now for many of these businesses. And certainly AI is going to change the dimensions there. But we got to be able to take this information, do something useful with it, turn it into engineering disciplines, and the ability to produce these things with product-like efficiency. We're just not there yet.
Yeah, those are all excellent points. And when you think about just how important these APIs are for acting as gateways, not just to innovation, but gateways to anything, gateways to getting data to do stuff in the business, you realize how important it is to get some consensus around this. Well, folks, don't touch that dial. I'll be right back. You're listening to Inside Analysis.
Do you own it? Welcome back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis. What a fun show today. We're talking to Lori MacVittie from F5 and David Linthicum from Deloitte and our good buddy Matt McLarty from Boomi. And we were just talking about architectural designs and busy being the enemy of creative. And I thought to myself, Matt, you had mentioned that mindset is really important here. And it's always important, especially in architectural discussions, because if you solve something way up high or way down low in the architecture, that can have a trickle effect and improve everything along the way. And it reminded me of a moment in my childhood when I was really blown away by Carl Sagan, billions and billions of stars. And he was talking about a two-dimensional world. And he did like a little exercise where he had bits of paper on a table. And he said, these are two-dimensional creatures and they're moving around. But imagine if all of a sudden someone comes along and picks one up and now it's in a third dimension. And that little piece of paper can see all the other pieces of paper down there. Like, holy Christmas, look at that. Now I can see everything. That's why I couldn't get over there, because this guy was in the way and that guy was in his way. And I was just, I'll never forget that. I was like, wow, that is very interesting to step outside of the construct that is confining you and see it from that perspective can be very powerful. And there are lots of ways to do that in IT, right? What do you think, Matt?
Absolutely. I think Mel Conway of Conway's Law fame has been talking about this a lot recently, about the containing system, and always trying to think from the perspective of the containing system that contains the system that you're thinking from. So, it's something that David was talking about earlier, how we can use APIs as a level of abstraction to just get us a lot further along with solving problems. But we're seeing this all over the place. I think, we've had, for a while now, for years, maybe even decades, we've been running up against the capacity. It's almost a societal issue. Like we run up with all this, we've got digital transformation going on, all this, growth based on digital means, the web explosion, now the AI explosion. There's more and more reliance on this skill set around being a software engineer. And there's only so many software engineers out there, right? And I would argue there will only ever be, some percentage of the population that can be software engineers. It's just the way that we're all wired. So we need to think about, how do you, first of all, think more broadly than just taking the perspective of the software engineer? Because you said, busy is the enemy of creative. Software engineers are very busy and they have an engineering mindset. I think a lot of the issues that we see where design maybe gets pushed aside, where people are thinking from the perspective of the lower layers, not necessarily from the perspective of the business, comes because so much reliance has been put on these busy software engineers. So I think APIs offer us the opportunity to come up a level and have a level of abstraction, to bring more cooks into the kitchen, right? To bring more people of different backgrounds to become not only users of technology, but builders of technology, builders of software-based solutions, designers, to some extent developers. And that's kind of a personal mission in terms of the work that I've been doing and that we're doing at Boomi, is to lower the barrier of entry. But I think even APIs themselves, though, can present sort of a barrier to entry, because they assume that developers are going to take in the specs, build the apps that use the APIs. And so how do we even, provide even more abstraction and more accessibility? And I think that's another place where maybe AI plays a role here. Not so that it creates a bunch of digital pollution, like is possible if you were to, I've seen a lot of articles lately where people are saying, well, AI is going to write all the code. You don't need coders anymore, right? Well, how many times have we heard that? And the fact is, like, it will just write, it probably could write some stuff, but you're not necessarily, the design problem comes in again, because you could write a bunch of, like, a Rube Goldberg machine spaghetti code that's going to do the job, but not do it efficiently. But I think there are ways that we can use AI to just be more inclusive. And when you get more inclusion of more people who can be builders, you're going to get more ideas and you're going to get more perspectives. And I think maybe you'll get more of a priority around design and the human element of the systems that we build.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think that's all very accurate and compelling. Lori, maybe I'll throw this one over to you. Kind of getting back to how the API layer is your business layer. We talk about data is the new oil and all this kind of stuff, and it's valuable if it's refined right? If it's just crude oil, that's not, you can't do a whole lot with that. It has to be refined. But what I love about this conversation here is thinking about how, you think about the DevOps world and how developers working directly with operations people fundamentally changed the relationship or the nature of IT and the nature of building things. And it was great because you put these people in contact, they can have direct conversations, build stuff. Now, the documentation, I think, was a bit of a casualty and all that. And so, knowing what was done and being able to fix it, that was, a little bit of a challenge. But when I think about it, yeah, you want the developers talking to the business, and you want the data people as well sitting at that table talking about the data, because the data tells you what's happening. Like whatever data is moving through your organization right now, that's what your organization is doing. And APIs are this really interesting choke point in that process. So, when you can't have governance, for example, if you don't cover every space of entry, right? If you just have a big open wall in the back, then you don't have governance. And so in that sense, APIs are a tool in the governance space. What do you think?
Oh, sure. And I mean, ultimately, you're talking the problem of silos, right? We siloed, right? And we broke the dev and the ops silo, and we said, here, play in the same place. Now, maybe they'll put out an API that's the same, but the people over on the ops side and the network or the security side, well, they've got their own APIs. It goes back to what, David was alluding to earlier, right? Every cloud has their own API, and every tool had their own API. It's like the St. Ives, right, poem, and every cat had 7 kits, and every cloud had 7 APIs, and every API had 7. It just goes on. And it's complex, and it's all rooted in this idea of silos and building ivory towers and kingdoms, and right. I mean, we could go into the philosophy of all of that, but it's really that we've got all these silos, and we just keep excluding people. And so we don't build and think from a higher level. I need this, so I'm going to build an API to do it. And I don't stop and think, well, but they need to do the same thing. It's just maybe a different data source or a little bit different. Maybe we should talk. No, I have to get my stuff done. Right. It's just, so it perpetuates, right? It's just continually this problem of we're building things down here instead of up at the higher layers at an abstracted layer, right? Above everything.
That's a good point. And David, I'll bring you back in. We have a good comment from our virtual studio audience here. One of our folks is saying, good point. What is broken that needs to be fixed? Calling it design distracts from this fundamental, in my opinion. I mean, you do have to watch out for these words, right? People hear like an assessment. Oh God, no, I don't want to do an assessment. No, thank you. Design for some people is like, yes, let's design. For other people, it's like, no, I'm too busy. But how do you articulate this to the business? I mean, obviously, people in certain roles are going to know, the chief technology officer, the CIO, the CISO, they all need to know about this stuff. How do you get other people to care about it, I guess is the question, David.
Yeah, I think you need to put it into tiers, which we have a tendency not to do. So we'll put a developer and we'll put an architect for a particular application to deal with all of the tier layers down to the resource APIs that we're dealing with. And I think that the API design that we need to get into is so specialized, it probably warrants that we have a certain community of users and designers and engineers that just deal with the API layer. And therefore, if they're able to develop amazing APIs that are able to do amazing things for the applications, and we have a certain layer. Right now, we have inconsistency with developing APIs within enterprises because we have different teams in there developing APIs using whatever best of breed technology they think they need to leverage and trying to build them as best they can. And they're always going to be different from silo to silo to silo, to Lori's point made earlier. So we need to think that this is really kind of the common interface that gets into the business. So in other words, if the business is going to be a giant application or data source unto itself, what kind of APIs or interfaces or services do we need to stand up that best accesses the business? And that includes some of the AI capabilities that are moving forward, to Matt's point. So then we can build applications very easily off of these systems. We can build orchestrations layers easily off these systems. We just have the idea now that everything's down to an application platform and everybody's going to build and design an application, including the APIs. I think they should be torn off and they should be abstracted. And we have a certain level of expertise that works on the APIs for the particular business. Some enterprises are doing aspects of that, but they're not getting to a point where it's at a level of scale that is beneficial.
Yeah. Wow. Those are all excellent points. abstract it out. It is a specialty. It's an area of specialization, and we do want to still have specialization. I mean, it's so fascinating how this Gen AI stuff is shaking up the educational world and the creative world, and it's just starting. I mean, I got to tell you, folks, that we are at the first phase of disruption from these new foundational models is really what they are. And right now they are focused on creating content, but we're getting smart about embeddings and vector databases and things of this nature. Anchors of truth is what Brian Raymond from unstructured.io called it. And I heard that, I was like, oh, I'm going to steal that term, but I'm going to use that every day, all day. Anchors of truth. The podcast bonus segment is coming up next, folks. Send me an email, info@insideanalysis.com. You're listening to Inside Analysis.
In the know. I'm Sarah.
Okay, folks, time for the podcast bonus segment here on a fantastic show. What wonderful guests we've had. David Linthicum of Deloitte, Lori MacVittie of F5, and Matt McLarty of Boomi. And maybe I'll go in that order. You know, David, design is so important these days, and we really do have a wonderful opportunity now to redesign things, right? When big changes come, I remember learning that in Mandarin, the character for chaos is very similar to the character for opportunity. There's just one little change on it, because guess what? When there's chaos, there's tremendous opportunity to reorganize and recrystallize. And I kind of see us in that place right now with this Gen AI disrupting the apple cart. Everyone's paying attention now. Okay, we got to do something different. Now is a great time to redesign systems. What do you think, David?
No, I absolutely agree. Now's the time. I tell this to my clients all the time. Now's the time to start doing things right. And so stop building technical debt. Start putting a lot of discipline in how you build and deploy these systems, how you're going to create these interfaces are going to be durable from system to system and last many years. They're going to provide more value to the business. We just got to get into that way of thinking. Right now, we're very much in terms of being event driven and certainly managed by magazine, which is, was more relevant when people actually read magazines. But we go after every tech trend that's out there. We go after every tech trend that's out there in the business, and not necessarily understand the design value that's able to bring back to the business. And I think we need to look at that with that kind of a lens. I'm kind of in the mode of, it's okay to leverage new technology, but it's also good to leverage disciplined designs and architecture around making sure that technology is optimized for the specific business problems we're looking to solve. And that thinking is not out there anymore. It used to be probably more prevalent in the 80s and 90s when computing was so expensive and resources were so much at a premium, right, where it's just not the case anymore. We can allocate, a terabyte of space on a cloud computing system in 5 minutes, and then we're off to the races. And sometimes that's not the best way to do it.
Wow. Just because you can doesn't mean you should, right? That's the old mantra there. Lori MacVittie, what do you think? What's the future here? What can we do now? Give your opinion on this being a great time to redesign systems.
Run, just run. That's so it's
save yourself.
my answer. Yeah, save yourselves. No, I like what David had said earlier about tiers and about thinking right at that higher level. We have a tendency to think that an API is an interface to an application. So we think, oh, it's just about getting into this application instead of it's an interface to a process or to a system, to some other thing. And so we don't design based on that. We're like, here's this application, or maybe there's this piece of infrastructure, and we're just putting out an API as a programmatic way to do X. Oh, you have a task here, I'll put an API on it. Well, it's not really design, right? That's enablement or accessibility, but it's not design. You're not thinking about what do you need to do and how does this need to interact with other pieces of the business or the infrastructure or other applications. And you really need to get into that point, right? And build a tier of APIs that has no application behind it. It is an interface, right? It's a way to talk to things.
Wow, that's cool. And batting cleanup here, Matt McLarty of Boomi. I remember reading, and I can see myself in the airplane reading this article many years ago now of an interview with Steve Jobs. He had this great quote about design that I'll never, ever forget. He said, most people in the tech world view design as sort of a veneer that you put on the outside or on the top of this thing that you've built. He goes, we don't think of it that way. For us, design is form and function woven together. And I thought to myself, man, that's a smart dude. Like he really thought that stuff through. And then, of course, you have to be incredibly disciplined. I mean, that was the thing about Steve Jobs, is that he may have not been the nicest guy to run across in the hallways, but he was incredibly disciplined. And that discipline really moved through the organization. And that's why they changed the world. But what do you think, Matt?
I think it's a great point, because designing APIs, I think in the software world in general, when we think design, the first thing people think of is UI design. And if you go and find someone who's in the design discipline in the software, they're generally thinking of things from the UI perspective. But APIs are a user interface. It's just that the user is the developers. But there's even a macro level of API design where you're actually, to the Jobs quote, you're designing the structure of your business, of your digital business, right? And this goes back to what Lori was saying earlier. Like, this is the representation of your business. Organizations that do this right, they're not focused, even hyper-focused in API design, on coming up with the greatest open API spec or the perfect, protocol for how they're going to represent the APIs. It's actually getting the structure of the business right. And so, and where do you put that? Like, where does that fit in the discipline of organizations? I think that there are some organizations that might have a business architecture function. I think there's just a lot of missing parts. So you kind of have to unwind everything. And I think, again, looking at why we keep making the same mistakes, I just don't think we're measuring the cost of things in the right way. So for organizations to get the political capital to change things, I think they have to start measuring the cost of not designing the structure right. And I'm actually writing a book, co-authoring a book on this whole topic of composability and APIs and this structuring of an organization around it. And one of the, Cox Automotive was one of the companies we work with, and they've have some great insights on how they were culturally established the default approach to building things as you're going to provide options and reusability by default. And then if you make a choice to do things in a hurried up way, that's the exception. And you have to defend it. So that type of deep cultural change is what's kind of needed, I think, to get the right thinking on design to the top of the menu again.
Yeah, I love it. We'll look these folks up online. David Linthicum, Deloitte, Lori MacVittie from F5, and Matt McLarty from Boomi. And send me an email, info@InsideAnalysis.com. If you want to get on the show, we'll talk to you next time. You've been listening to Inside Analysis.